Hi everyone. Does the microphone work?
Yes.
Okay, great. So my name is Kate and I'm going to be introducing and asking some questions for our panelists here. So today we have Jackie Valle. So she is currently serving as the coalition coordinator with TakeRoot Justice. And she has a long career as a housing organizer. She is the former director of organizing for the Fifth Avenue Committee in Brooklyn, and the former director at the Housing Conservation Coordinators. She's also the founder of CASA, which is Community Action for Safe Apartments. And in addition to these organizing duties, she is also chair of the board for the Met Council on Housing. We also have Harry DeRienzo here. So he is the founder and former president of Banana Kelly Community Improvement Association, and he has fought for the preservation and affordability of housing in the South Bronx for decades. He has also served as general counsel for the Prodnick Foundation from 1982 to 2006. And he has also written extensively about land use issues and housing in New York City. We also have Melanie Wang, who is the Chinatown Tenants Union lead organizer for CAAAV, which is the Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence. And before joining CAAAV in 2016, she worked in domestic worker and retail organizing movements. And last but not least, we have Ava Farkas, who has been an organizer for a decade, working on wage issues in New York City, and is the chair and is the director of the Met Council on Housing. If you don't mind, if you could all just say a little bit about yourself quickly before we get to questions, your organization.
Okay, again, Harry DeRienzo. I've been doing community development work for the past 45 years or so, and I've seen a lot of changes both in New York City and in the activism and organizing environment in New York City. I'm very happy to be here, and we see you all here, so right now on Saturday.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Ava Farkas. I'm the director of Met Council on Housing. We're the city's oldest tenant organizing group. We've been around for 60 years. Just celebrated our 60th anniversary in November. And we do sort of 3 areas of work. We do tenant education to educate tenants about their rights as rent-stabilized tenants and how to exercise those rights. We work with tenants to organize tenant associations in their buildings, and we fight for policy that will change the balance of power between real estate and renters. So we were part of the Housing Justice for All statewide coalition that won major changes in the rent laws in June, and I'm happy to talk about that.
Yep, so I'm Jackie, and I actually forgot I worked all those places, so thank you for reminding me. And currently the organization I'm at is called TakeRoot Justice. We were part of the Urban Justice Center and have spun off to be our own independent group. And we work to provide legal support and participatory research for community groups in the areas of housing, consumer justice, immigration, workers' rights. And yeah, it's been very kind of interesting to move from where I did day-to-day organizing, and then I kind of had a lifestyle change and a baby, so I had to move to a job where I had evenings free. But I get to work with actually most of these groups here. Actually, all the groups here. Yeah, that's really exciting.
Good morning. My name is Melanie. I am, as was said, the Chinatown Tenants Union lead organizer at CAAAV. So CAAAV is a Pan-Asian grassroots organization. We're based in Chinatown, and right now we work mostly in tenant organizing, so very similar to what Ava described that Met Council does in terms of organizing tenants on a grassroots level to deal with issues in their building or in their community, and also to work on policy and sort of greater social change issues. I think what makes us a little bit different from Met Council is that we organize both in rent stabilized and public housing. So I organize rent stabilized Chinatown Tenants, and then there are also several other organizers on staff who focus on public housing tenants, mostly right now Queensbridge houses, but also we're moving into other NYCHA developments in the area of Queensbridge. And then the other thing that makes us different is that we organize primarily with working class Asian immigrant communities. So right now across our programs we organize Chinese, Bengali, and Korean tenants. It is a major challenge, but one of our goals as an organization is to be able to build multilingual, multi-ethnic spaces that are oriented towards social justice.
Thank you so much to our panelists for talking a little bit more about their organizations. Now we want to move into questions. My name is Dara. So we would like to hear more about how you think strategies have changed within your organization, whether you've been at the same organization or you shifted to an organization.
Can I propose someone else take this question first?
I've done this a lot.
Being the most junior among us.
That's a nice way of saying it. So I started out when I was around your age working as an organizer for the then emerging Northwest Bronx Community Clergy Coalition. We learned organizing techniques, basically Alinsky-style organizing techniques, rules for radicals. I'm sure you guys are familiar with that. And the common theme with Alinsky's organizing approach was, first you find commonality among the people that you're working with, and a lot of times that might be through a union, and for IAF, I guess mostly through a church. And then you find a common enemy of the people that you're working with, and then you find that person's weakness or entity's weakness, and you start attacking that, and blah, blah, blah. So those techniques were employed when I was an organizer for the Northwest Bronx. And we, as you know, Northwest Bronx became a very important force in the Bronx and a very important partner in the change in the rent laws that were exacted recently. And when I went to the South Bronx, what I found was there was a lot of commonality, but no common enemy. The government was retrenching, landlords were abandoning, after they, torched their buildings. So you had no government to attack, you had no landlords to attack, the insurance companies were gone, the banks were gone. So it wasn't like organizing against something, it was like organizing for something. And the big change I've seen in organizing over the last 40 plus years is that it was very difficult being an organizer during that period of time. The time of the fires, we lost 175,000 people during that period of time in the South Bronx. But there were existing communities, strong communities, and the talent of an organizer was, how do you identify and tap into existing social networks among people? And so as an organizer, I would go on a block, I'd see some person, I guess my age, sitting on the stoop and talk to that person, find out, who to talk to, and before you knew it, you saw there was already an organized group of people through social networks, informal networks. Where's the jobs? Who's taking care of my kids? It was a real sense of community then. Over the period of the last 40 years, with the changes in the economy, with living wage jobs being few and far between and non-existent in some areas, with the severe cutbacks in public supports, people have been marginalized socially, politically, and economically, and those social networks, at least in the areas like the South Bronx, are not there anymore. And people that we work with are struggling to, they're one paycheck or 1 month away from being evicted. They're struggling every day. They're dependent upon local institutions to do the things that those social networks used to do. And so organizing, I would say, is like 100 times harder now than it was 40 years ago, because part of what we're trying to do is to reconnect people to one another and sort of rebuild community in the process of also organizing as well. So go into a building, and sometimes you just can't have a meeting in the public hallway. You first have to go to people's houses, knock on their doors, sit in their kitchen, talk to them, bring other neighbors in, and try to, connect people. So I think it's much harder to organize now than it was so many years ago. And that would be the main difference I see now as opposed to, let's say, 1960s and 70s.
I can talk a little bit about, so I've been at Met Council for 5 years, and I could compare and contrast like the strategy we had on the rent law fight 5 years ago with this past June. So the rent laws that regulate all of the rent-regulated apartments, which is about 1 million apartments in New York City and suburbs, is decided in Albany. So we've always had a major challenge in that the base of people affected that are going to organize around the issue are in New York City, but the politicians and the decisions are made in Albany. And so the representatives from the city, we can pressure them, but they're not the only ones deciding. There's also representatives from around the state, and there's the governor. And the governor gets a ton of real estate donations. So in 2015, when the rent laws used to sunset, and so there was always an opportunity to push and have a campaign to try to strengthen them and close loopholes that the real estate industry had managed to win in the late 90s. And so we were using sort of a similar playbook for a very long time. Every couple of years that the rent laws came up, different formations of coalitions of neighborhood, grassroots tenant organizations would get together from the city mainly and try to pressure the governor because the two houses were also, the Senate was controlled by the Republicans and the Assembly was controlled by the Democrats. So we only really had the Democrats to pressure in the Assembly and the governor to pressure. Because the Republicans were against our agenda in the Senate. So we didn't make any headway in 2015. We weren't able to pressure the governor. We were too scared to pressure the leader of the Assembly directly, Carl Hastie. And we pretty much the status quo. The laws were renewed, nothing was really changed, the same types of loopholes remained. In 2019, we worked on a new strategy, which was to bring in renters from around the state, which is a totally new type of strategy, which not totally new in the history of the tenant movement. This was attempted like in the 70s and 80s, I believe. I'm not great on my historical timeline, but at different points there was an attempt to create a statewide tenant movement, but it really gained momentum this year. And in part, I think because around the country and other states, there's been a rebirth of organizing around renters' issues, and a type of policy called good cause eviction has been something that's been a campaign in many different states, and it provides a limit on how much the rent can be increased and more protections. It's not a guarantee necessarily of that you can stay in your home lease after lease, but it gives you more ability to do that. So we kind of united these issues of gaining new rights for renters that had no protections, still have no protections in the rest of the state, with the downstate base of renters that we've always been organizing with. And we started not just demanding that we go back to the rent regulation we had in the 80s and early 90s, but that we expand the rights for renters that have not been covered. So going on the offensive as a strategy, like demanding something new, really I think took like legislators by surprise. Like they're so used to just hearing like, we just want what we lost. That's like basically been our demands, like give us back what we lost. And now we were saying something new, like give all renters protections, not just in New York City, but around the state. And that, I think, going on the offensive and demanding something new and broadening our power and base was really effective. And we also decided not to target the governor, but to target the leadership of the Assembly and the Senate instead, which are much more responsive to us because we could do canvases in their district. So in Carl Heastie's district in the Bronx, for the first time, we actually went every week. We had members of Met Council and of other organizations, DSA, would go every weekend and go door to door in buildings, rental buildings, and talk to Carl Heastie's constituents. And then we delivered 1,000 petitions to him towards the end of the session. And we ended up winning. We ended up being able to close almost all of the loopholes. So all our old demands were finally passed, and we got an expansion of rights to the rest of the state. We didn't win everything we were fighting for, but we got much more than I think we would have gotten had we just demanded like the same program that we were demanding in the past.
Well, thank you. I also think it cannot be overstated how major and transformative the rent laws victory was this spring. When I started organizing in early 2000, we were still, and I was in the Bronx then, feeling like the effects of the rent laws that were really gutted had continued to be gutted. And 1997 was a pretty bad year where the laws were really weakened, and that combined with a deregulation on financial markets and how you do banking and how you can package and sell mortgages was leading to a lot of money, a lot of corporate money pouring into rent-stabilized housing stock. Kind of in comparison to Harry's story, because I was in some of those same neighborhoods, you went from having disinvestment and people and a community that was mainly made up of people who had lived through that, to a feeling of like, oh wait, we care about this again because we can make money, so we're gonna start pushing people out. So we went to actually from, the movement suddenly had a lot of targets. It had your landlord, it had who was on the sort of like board of directors and part of the LLC corporation. There's the whole piece around enforcement, which is both several city agencies as well as state agencies. And then, of course, if the rent laws are weak, you're only doing so much. So I think that's sort of been sort of a challenge throughout this, and trying to I think each tenant association had to be kind of nimble. You would bring mostly repairs issues against with your landlord, and then somehow that would lead into affordability and rent laws, and there were a lot of really interesting campaigns, and overall I'd say the arc was to do things on a very legislative level, which has strengths and weaknesses, where Ava mentioned kind of the 70s, and my impression of the 70s, even the 80s, was there was such a distrust of government that people were still trying to operate outside. Like, wait, you abandoned us. We don't want you to come back and try to fix anything, We don't want you to tell us how you're going to rezone the neighborhood. You're not our experts here. And I mean, that still continues today, but I think that was pretty strong. And then it really shifted in the 90s and 2000s, where a lot of the campaigns were focused on trying to pass reform laws at the agency and city level. Right.
Man, so many things are coming up. I'm thinking about so many things. It's hard to narrow down what to talk about. There's like the ways that housing organizing has changed in the very short amount of time that I've been involved in housing and organizing in New York City, but then also in this larger scope. There's the ways that organizing and I think just the general social perspective on organizing has shifted, which I feel is, at least for somebody who's 26, I went to college, my freshman year of college was the first year of Occupy Wall Street. Yes, yeah. Okay, I just don't know what familiarity levels are and or like how old people were. Yeah, so we had like an Occupy Wall Street encampment on our campus. And I remember it was obviously a huge movement, but at the same time, I think it was perceived as really fringe amongst the general student body. And I don't, just personally, anecdotally, I don't think people look at organizing that way anymore. In that I feel that community organizing, grassroots organizing has come more and more into the center of social dialogue. My like general observation of our like high school and college-aged supporters at CAAAV, like folks who come in to volunteer, folks who support protests and actions, is that it's a really popular topic for people to engage in. I think a lot of that has to do with Trump, right? That when we're feeling so hopeless on a federal level, we turn to local and community-based organizing, we turn to power where we can build it, instead of feeling that some, one very, very special person elected to the presidency is going to change all our lives, you know. But I think just speaking to the changes that I've seen in my 3.5 years at CAAAV and in New York, in terms of like what's possible and strategies, as I said earlier, we are involved in public housing organizing in Queensbridge Houses, and if anybody's familiar, you might know that Queensbridge Houses is very close to the site of the proposed Amazon HQ2 development. When that development was announced last October, maybe early November, so a little over a year ago, we were like 3 weeks into an executive director change, which is just like organizationally is a big deal. We have a staff of like 8 or 9 people, so for us to be switching, for any organization to be switching leadership is a big deal. For us to be switching leadership, we were like, we're gonna be completely different, everything has to be shifted. And we were, 3 weeks deep into that, everyone was still kind of feeling very, very unstable, and then Amazon was like, we are coming to Queensbridge Houses, by the way. And we were like, well, this is, you could have planned that timing better, Amazon. But I think it became very clear very quickly that that the size and scope of that development was going to have an enormous impact, not only on the residents that we organize in Queensbridge Houses, and their lives and their neighbors' lives, but also Long Island City, Queens, all of New York City. Obviously, it was a huge point of discussion. And so it became very clear also that we had to be involved. But I think from the beginning, to me at least, especially not working directly in Queens, it felt like very much a David and Goliath fight, right? And just with the timeline, with the size and scope of Amazon as a corporation and as a political entity, it was very difficult to understand like what kind of power we might be able to exercise when sometimes like organizing a building and just getting one landlord to do repairs properly feels like the worst, like little what's the treadmills that the hamsters run on? A hamster treadmill. Yeah. It's just like just a hamster wheel of like running and running and running and going nowhere. But I think kind of building a little bit off of what Harry's saying, sometimes having a common enemy can be super helpful, is very much necessary. And naming your enemy is necessary, and also like what Ava said in terms of like rent laws and expanding the coalition and expanding our targets based on what people, not just in New York, but the whole state needed, like having a huge sort of common enemy like Amazon come in and knowing the impact and stakes that were there for many Queens communities really, I think, changed the game and forced organizations who have worked alongside each other for a long time, who have strong relationships, to like not just work alongside each other, but to operate in lockstep. Like they had like 8 a.m. coordinating meetings every single week, which if you know organizers, we don't run on an 8 a.m. schedule. And just, having a major enemy and having a major fight like that really forced us all to figure out how to operate together in ways that, at least in my experience, were really, really new and different. And then also the size and scope of the issue gave us a platform publicly that felt very, very new and different, and also felt kind of serendipitous to other political changes happening in Queens in terms of like the election of AOC, right? And then, then later after Amazon pulled out, but like the DA campaign with Tiffany Caban and so forth, right? There's a lot of things are happening that feels serendipitous to me a little bit, but in reality they're not serendipitous. It's like the product of different social changes coming to a head, right, and our reactions. Anyways, so going back to the Amazon story, all of that happened, and I thought this campaign would last years. I thought this would be a years-long fight. And then this February, I was sitting in our office with one of our members, Mr. Chen, doing an interview with a local reporter, nothing about Amazon, about Mandarin language and Fudanese language interpretation in housing port, right? So we're sitting, Mr. Chen's talking, I'm interpreting, the reporter's listening, we're having this great discussion. We're supposed to do an interview for something like an hour. 15 minutes into the interview, my phone and the reporter's phone start buzzing, just going completely off the hook. And so I looked down at my phone and completely abandoned Mr. Chen. I'm like, I'm sorry, we have to stop this interview because Amazon had announced, I think fairly unexpectedly, that they were pulling out of the city, right? And that was February 14th. It was Valentine's Day, which I'll never forget. So it was a campaign that all in all lasted 4 months. About 4 months. So seeing a win like that happen was paradigm shifting, and seeing a win like the rent laws passing this year was paradigm shifting, right? Maybe even more so because there were really concrete impacts felt right away from the rent law stuff. And then reading last week in the Wall Street Journal that evictions of New York City tenants have gone down 46% since the rent law passed, right? Not just paradigm shifting, life-changing, right? So having this sense of what's really possible through organizing and knowing how popular, or not popular, but how much organizing and the need for community-based social change work is becoming widely understood, and even hearing John talk about the community change program, I think it just gives me a lot of hope.
Thank you so much to our panelists for answering that first question. I'm going to pass the microphone now to my co-moderator.
Thanks. So most of you have mentioned you've organized throughout the city, oftentimes with socioeconomically marginalized communities, and with that in mind, we're curious to know what kind of work goes into supporting tenants and communities that may not have the time or the financial resources to organize.
Okay, so does everyone here understand some of the, when we talk about the implications of the change in the rent laws, do you have a clear understanding of why that's so important? I mean, just a couple of things, because I've had a history of taking over distressed housing, and a number of things that the landlords did that they no longer can do, is there was always an incentive to, if there was a market for a building, there was always an incentive to get rid of the tenants. And you get rid of the tenants by a whole number of ways. Turning off the gas, starting to renovate an apartment, tearing out the kitchens and bathrooms, then leaving it there for like 6 months at a time until people move out. Why were they doing this? They were doing this because when you had a vacancy, you got a 20% vacancy allowance on the vacancy lease. So someone comes in new, you get a 20% vacancy allowance increase. Plus, if you did any MCIs, like now you fix the kitchen up. Now you do some roof work, whatever. Now you get MCIs, you get individual apartment improvements. So you might have an $800 a month rent that now is $1,500 a month. We've had people come into our neighborhoods, pay like $200,000 and $300,000 a unit for a building, and in the mortgage document itself, it said the rents upon, let's say, purchase are $800. Within 3 years, they'll be $1,200, $1,300, $1,400. So basically, the mortgages themselves were basically telling the speculator, you had to get rid of the people that are there, because that's the only way you can pay back the bank. Another big thing, and it's still a problem, by the way, is that people would say, come into my unit, you can pay $1,000 a month, but your legal rent's going to be $3,000 a month. But I'm going to give you a concessionary preferential rent of $1,000 a month. And they would do that for 4 years because there was basically a 4-year statute of limitations look-back period on the registrations. So after 4 years, all of a sudden your rent goes up to $3,000 a month because under the old law, upon renewal of your lease, you can go to the legal rent, right? With the new laws, you can't do that anymore. If I give you a $1,000 a month apartment, for as long as you live there, you only get the rent guidelines increases on the $1,000, not the $3,000. However, you know, and they also changed the look-back period. Now you can go back beyond 4 years. So it's not a solid 4 years statute of limitations anymore, but if you go back beyond 4 years, it's still, the onus is on the tenant to prove fraud. And I think that's something that you also could continue to look at. So in terms of your question, what was your question again?
What kind of work goes into supporting tenants who might not have the time or the financial resources to organize or to participate in this kind of activism?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question, and maybe some of my colleagues on the panel can answer it better than I can. But you know, people's lives are more strained than they were, let's say, 30, 40 years ago. There's less time to participate, but people do find time if there's an issue that resonates with them. In our organizing work at Banana Kelly, we're involved in campaign work, but we're also involved in kind of organizing that we think is long-term, structural, institutional. We want to effectively, campaigns are critical. Without campaigns, you know, people need redress. You got to live, you got to have a roof over your head, you got to eat today, so things have to happen. But our goal, I guess all of our goals ultimately, is we want to change the power sharing arrangements, like you said, between real estate and tenants, but not just between, you know, the power structures that are and the people we represent. We want to see those power sharing arrangements change, and the way we try to do it at Banana Kelly is we want to control the land, and we want our people to control our institutions. And so we converted from a straight housing service organization. 5 years ago, we became a mutual housing association, so our residents now are a majority of our board of directors. We have a resident council, which is our leadership group, where the board of directors, the majority is fed from. That's where we get the majority of our board members. And we're actively organizing tenant associations, which is a really, really tough job, because when you have an emergency, it's a lot easier to organize people, and especially when there's a common enemy, and the common enemy is right in front of your face. But when people have to, when the emergency is over, and you get back to, you know, your life, you've got a job, you've got kids, you've got, you know, the stresses of family and people moving in with you. It's the same story we've heard for generations. So it's a tough organizing work, but it's something that has to continue, and we have to continue to do. Does anyone else want to?
Sure. I mean, I would say like our whole organization is really set up to be a resource to support tenants in organizing. So that looks like having a full-time staff person dedicated to tenant organizing who is there to train tenants and support them in being able to run a campaign in their building with their neighbors. So teach them how to door knock and agitate other tenants, how to strategize and figure out like who's the right common enemy to pressure and how to pressure them. We also partner with groups like Manhattan Legal Services, who will provide free legal representation to groups of tenants who are taking their landlord to court or taking some type of legal action. And so they're designed to work with tenants who are low income. So we like match the buildings up with the lawyers. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the answer.
You should go. Yeah, you actually have some really good things that you do for this.
Yeah. Okay. It's a complex question. I think some of the first things that come to mind for me are having skills and practice to think about access, right? Access to spaces, which I think for me is an umbrella concept that embodies a lot of things. embodies a lot of things related to economic justice, disability justice, language justice, right? So when you think about access to a space, it's about learning to ask questions like, is this meeting like physically accessible for everyone who I want to be there? Or not I want, but who needs to be there, who should be there. So in Chinatown, the population I work with is mostly seniors. Chinatown is an aging immigrant community, right? A lot of folks live in tenements, live in walk-ups, and they're older, but a lot of other folks, use wheelchairs, use walkers, that kind of stuff. So one thing that's important for us is having a ground floor office with no accessibility obstacles, right? But so physical access, thinking about, who can come into the space, how the space is set up in terms of like chairs and mobility, how long is everybody gonna have to be sitting, how long the meeting is, that sort of thing. We think about access in terms of economics, right? So when is the meeting? Our meetings are always on Sundays at CAAAV, right? So I work on a Sunday through Thursday schedule, and we have Sunday meetings for our leadership groups and our like general membership, right? Which it's not available to everybody. Obviously, there are a lot of folks, working class folks. Chinatown, we have a lot of construction workers, a lot of restaurant workers. People work on Sundays. People work 7 days a week. People work in the evenings. People are working all the time. But Sundays, Sunday afternoons, I think a good number of our folks who are on 6-day-a-week schedules, they'll have Sunday free and they can come by, right? We try to have volunteers available to look after children because a lot of people are taking care of their kids or their grandkids, right? And so if they are coming to our office on Sunday for a meeting, then the kids have got to go somewhere, right? Once we had like 12 kids hanging out in sort of our like the smaller office space while we had a meeting in the larger office space, and some volunteers were looking after them. And then I came out into the area where the kids were at. It was the summer and the fans were on, and like one of the 3 or 4-year-olds had found some chalk and was like crumbling the chalk in front of the fan because it was fun to play with, which resulted in chalk dust covering the entire room. Just like everything in a thin film of like yellow and pink chalk. And then I was dusting that for weeks. So you make some sacrifices. And then another thing, in terms of access, people that we work with have really varied education levels, right? So in Chinatown we have a multiplicity of languages. Some people speak Mandarin, some people speak Cantonese, even more people speak smaller dialects of Chinese like Fujianese, Toisanese, etc. And then they might have limited language capacity in a more mainstream dialect like Mandarin, right? So not only am I, as a native English speaker, or I don't know, a heritage Mandarin speaker, I don't know how to put it, but not only am I like communicating in Mandarin, they're communicating in their second language to me, right? Or sometimes like I can only communicate in Mandarin and they can't communicate in Mandarin at all, so they're speaking Fujianese, and I'm like, okay, I know about 6 words of Fujianese, but I swear I'm really trying. So working across language and working across folks' education levels is important. Thinking about if I'm running a meeting and there are a lot of like butcher papers on the walls to do power analysis, but not everybody in the room is literate in the language that we're writing in, right? Which is Chinese, it's not English, not everybody is literate. Well, okay, that's okay, right? We can still write, and folks who are not literate can still participate, and there'll still be a lot of usefulness, but like how can I use different colors or have photos up alongside the writing or other visual cues or sound cues or just something else that's gonna help them keep track of all the information that we're talking about, because God knows they're probably really good at remembering stuff, but we are also talking about a lot of things, so we just need to help them categorize, right? And understanding, different types of learning styles, different ways of processing information. And then the language piece, one thing that we do a lot of at CAAAV, because we were trying to work in this sort of like multilingual space, is language, justice work, and interpretation, right? So language and all other access things that I was talking about, those are axes of power is kind of how I think about it. Like those are ways that power is expressed, right? Whether or not a room is set up for wheelchair access is a way of expressing power of who's supposed to be there. Whether or not a meeting is set up to have language access is a way of expressing power and who's supposed to be there. So we think about language as a form of power. And our goal in having a multilingual meeting or a multilingual space, or even like bringing members to meet with an elected as a form of lobbying, and asking the elected to be open to having that meeting in Chinese is about a way of understanding how power is expressed and who has power in the room. So I think it's not just about like the meeting is in English and we're going to have somebody like translate it so people can understand, because language is not that simple, right? Instead, it's thinking about how is language a tool for power in this thing that we're doing, and how can we shift that so that everybody that speaks different languages can feel power in similar ways. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. I can talk about language and interpretation for about 3 more panels. So have me back, John.
I think just to kind of add most of these points that I had kind of written down, people have covered, and I think Harry first mentioned it, that one of the issues is people come together in times of crisis, and especially if you're already in a life situation that's already very challenging. One, how to make it, it's about like making sure that people still are invested in the organization and in the work after their crisis is over. And I think that goes a lot to the different relationships that you build and the relationships built with each other. People were talking about the importance of having childcare and the right spaces and bringing food and thinking about if people are giving up their time, what they're doing here. And what I found is that different members would start taking responsibility for those different pieces of it, which not only took the pressure off the organizer, who was trying to make sure like all things happened and everybody felt welcome and could participate, but once that became shared, you were actually like building community around it. And also the other issues is that a lot of some of the stronger tactics about confronting targets are a lot harder for people the more vulnerable they are. For a long time, a major tool that tenants had were rent strikes. You don't fix my apartment, we're not paying you rent. Boom. And I mean, that was very effective. And then these credit companies started collecting data on whether or not you were named either as a plaintiff or defendant in a housing court suit, and that affected your credit. And so that became really important to make sure that all the tenants knew that going in. We still hear stories about elderly couple moves to try to get some subsidized housing in Florida, and they have bad credit from the time that their landlord falsely took them to court for a non-payment. So that's kind of very real, I think, too, with especially with Trump coming to power. I think people feel very vulnerable if they're undocumented, and everyone has stories about landlords being very blunt about that, like, you need to stay out of the organizing, or I will call ICE. So I think one of the strategies dealing with this is sort of having a very honest conversation about who has more privilege and more safety in that situation, so that when you do sort of do actions, kind of figuring out who to put out in front and who needs to be in the back, or like who getting arrested could mean deportation, versus who getting arrested is like, wow, I spent the night in jail for the tenant movement. So there's a pretty big spectrum. So I think and that goes back to also having those relationships, so you kind of really know where people are at. And the last thing, and I think Melanie spoke about this really well, is just the importance of popular education. I would start every meeting, like say as MCIs, who knows about MCIs? And chances are the people in the room knew more than the organizers, and people could really learn from each other, so that you were really sure that you were meeting people where you were at. I think that's also pretty critical.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Our next question kind of talks about some of the topics that were already mentioned, but where do you see intersections in different campaigns, whether it be the relationship between housing and wage, or immigration and wage?
this is a great question. Harry said something earlier that I wrote down that people find time if the issue resonates, right? Which I think is a really important idea. I think what distinguishes for me organizing, grassroots organizing from like policy, advocacy, even activism, is that when you're organizing, when the goal is organizing, you're thinking about a base, right? A base being defined as the people who are involved in the organization or the issue, right? So organizing is about thinking about the base, building the base, building the number of people who are involved and have engagement and care, and then developing their leadership, their knowledge, their skills to do actions and to mobilize themselves and other people to act on that issue, right? So that's, to me, that's distinguished from policy or advocacy generally, because advocacy could be just like one or two people who know a lot sitting in a room making an argument, right? Yeah, that's